Thank you for having me. It sounds like today was amazing, actually. I wish I could have been here for more of it. I was working, as you do. So as Joe pointed out, or mentioned or whatever, last year I published this book, and it was a nonfiction account of a group of people, which most people didn't think was nonfiction somehow, which was a really strange moment. But mostly addressed as people who lived and worked in New York City. And one of the things I thought about afterwards, which I didn't talk a lot about in the book, but was something we talked about a lot with Joe, was how we move in the city, and we move in this sort of cat's cradle movement of like of going to the same place over and over again. We go home, we go to our offices, and then there are places in between those two, which we use. So I started to map how we use how a lot of us use New York City, actually. And one of the things about the book that was most notable was that the fun places were actually transportationally mostly between the sleeping places and the working places, which is either coincidence or part of the city that exists, or something. Wait, I'm just gonna set a timer here, because you know what? Sometimes you know when you're talking to people and suddenly you're like, have I been up here for 5 hours? And sometimes you haven't been. Okay, here we go. Timer, go. Stopwatch, start. And also the placement for especially young people in New York City of the L train there is exceedingly important to usher you from the funner places and the less fun places. And of course, all these people in the book were very different from each other. They some were they had a commonality of places they went to, but also there were places they all went to individually, including digitally. There were people in that group who used different websites. So there wasn't like a uniformity actually to this use. So the book was constructed from digital material because it was happening concurrently. There wasn't a lot of historical research, which was very nice. It was happening there. I was there for some of it. Some of it was recounted to me. And so it was constructed using a lot of it was constructed using recordings. New York City, New York State is a one-party consent state, and if you're a journalist, you know what that means, which means that only one party to a conversation must be giving permission to record, which is a part of the wiretapping law. This comes from copblock.org, by the way, which is sounds like a racy URL, but isn't. And they're actually concerned with civil liberties and watching the police. You're often arrested for recording the police and their duties, almost always illegally arrested. And that means that I could, in public spaces, record people. People have an expectation of privacy in their homes. They have some expectation of privacy at work. It's sort of up in the air a little bit. But according to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the general rule is that people in public places must assume they might be photographed or recorded. And then also the other part of the component of some of the reporting was digital text. So I have sort of endless IM conversations and emails and Facebook messages with people from the book, which have the vast benefit, unlike audio recordings, of being searchable. Which is like a whole new thing for reporters, right? It's suddenly like, instead of these hours of like useless audio tape, we have like, I can search for keywords. And not only that, not only do I have conversations with some of them in those forms, I have a lot of what we do online and on Facebook and on IM is send each other conversations with other people. So I have like the accruing data of other people things going on. There's very little verbatim quotation from any of that in the book. There's a little bit here, which I'll show you. Which is an IM conversation. Pardon me, this isn't terribly safe for work. Fortunately, you're all at work at NYU. So one thing is that, so before the book was published, I sent the book to people who were in it so they could read for mistakes and disasters and unnecessary doxing. This was sort of an awkward process. I'd spent all this time working on the book away from them, and these people didn't know what was being made, which is often what happens. I myself did not know what was being made through most of it. Originally, in the beginning of the book, I had a large cast of characters. A lot of them fell by the wayside, either because they were terrible subjects, because they were untruthful, because they were boring. And I left with that. So these people came, as these people had to read it, and there were a couple notable things about them looking at the manuscript. A couple of them gave carte blanche for publication for reading, didn't want to see it. I would probably fall in that camp myself. I don't like reading about myself. I would probably be like, yep, sounds fine, do whatever. Being exposed is a terrible feeling. The sort of most popular request was redaction of a few details for other characters. They wanted to make other people feel better about things that have been said, or conceal their identity better. But the number one thing was that even though only a couple of years had passed from the reporting to the manuscript, very important cat gif here, was that people didn't remember any of it. Like, it had been about 2 to 3 years, and most people were like, "I'm going to take your word for it." And these were events that people had lived through, had documented, and so much happens in the course of 3 years in all of our lives. Like, who remembers? If someone had written about me 3 years ago, I would remember very little, actually, of it. I would have to say, I'll take your word back. So when history is like a little less recent than that, it's sort of shocking how fast it all evaporates. So after the book was done, before it was published, I was sort of like wallowing around like a beached whale, basically. A book is terrible. It's sort of like a dissertation if you have one, except you don't get a degree at the end. It's sort of a terrible compromise. But the good part is if you've turned 30, you know this. People suddenly start to take you seriously when you turn 30. Like, suddenly you're an adult in their eyes, and they treat you like that. And the book is sort of like that too. Suddenly it's an instant credential. It's a very old-fashioned kind of credentialism. But I was sort of happy to benefit from it. So I was laying about reading things, basically, and my husband had brought home this catalog from an Alice Neel exhibition many years ago. Alice Neel is a painter, started in this was a catalog of her early work in the 30s. A very gripping cover there, by the way, like, kind of amazing. She was actually an incredible painter. The show took place at Robert Miller Gallery, had a really nice essay by Wayne Kustenbaum. And if you don't know her, she was mostly a portraitist. She was on contract with the WPA in the 30s and 40s. And so in this catalog, and it's her, by the way, she's totally dreamy, right? Look at her. She's like, do, do, do. You know, and this is a woman who painted, like, she, like, painted self-portraits of herself naked in the bathroom with her husband, and, was, like, totally cool. So, and then, so I was, like, leafing through this, and then there was this portrait. There's 4 of him in the portrait. It's a very small picture. It's, like, 8 inches, painted in 1933, and if you look carefully, there's dick in the middle. I would put that more graciously, but she was actually very famous for a painting the same year of a famous guy called Joe Gould, who was an infamous bohemian who spent his life writing a book that never came to pass. And had that, she gave him multiple penises in that, by the way, and surrounded him with other men who were naked, which was pretty bold. But besides the fact that he's clearly incredibly gay in this picture, if I may say so, there's also the text there were texts from an unknown source. I emailed Wayne Kustenbaum about this, who did the catalog essay, and he didn't know where it came from, but they're clearly recollections of hers about the people she had painted. So she said Christopher Lazar was the queen of the homosexuals, but there was a bigger queen than he was, but I can't remember his name. And then she goes on to praise this article on Lorenzo da Ponte for the New Yorker. And she said everybody was talking about it. And then he got a book advance and never wrote the book, and used up the advance, and that was it. I had never heard of this person. I'd never heard of anyone who'd heard of this person. He didn't really Google. But there's enough clues here, right? So clearly he'd written for the New Yorker, so it was possible to look those up. First, I found that this name Lazar was misspelled, which was interesting. This picture actually had gone unsold, so I started actually with the gallery that represents Alice Neel and the estate, and somehow this drawing had rested since 1933 in the estate and never changed hands, which was sort of wild. So I read both his pieces in the New Yorker. He only had 2 pieces in the New Yorker. Both are from 1944, which was actually 11 years after this portrait. So there's some funny thing by which she knew him ages before, and painted him ages before she had that recollection of him in the New Yorker. 1944 was a weird year, to say the least. It was the year Le Monde was founded. It was the year Danny DeVito was born. It was the year they found Anne Frank in the attic. So, a lot of things were going on. This is the first piece of his, you won't be able to read a thing about this from this vantage point. This is the first paragraph of the De Ponte piece, the story she mentions. It's an incredible story. I actually would, or if you like reading old New Yorkers, and I'm sure you do, it's, there's something about it that's so vivid. It's written in a style that most magazines aren't written anymore. This begins in 1805 with De Ponte on the ship coming to America. He'd written the librettos for Mozart's most famous operas, actually, and came and sort of, in many ways, brought opera to New York City, and ends with him being buried on 11th Street between First and A in an unmarked grave, which is pretty wild. And it was 100 years after De Ponte's life that Lazar was writing, and he writes in this way, if you can see much of this, that is incredibly intimate and close, and unlike the New Yorker currently, it exists entirely without sourcing. There's no credit to anything. There's no credit to letters. There's no I found this here. There's nothing. It's just straight storytelling with informed opinion in it, and that's very different. So here's the first paragraph of his second piece, which also appeared in 1944, 9 months later. It is the story of the introduction of ballet to New York, actually. So he covered two very similar topics in similar periods. Francisque Houtine was the ballerina, but he suggests early on in the piece a woman, or was it a man, whose execution of the first few romantic ballet steps ever seen on a local stage created a controversy that resulted in the earliest American attempt at theatrical censorship. It's sort of an incredible story, and he doesn't actually get to the... he's got suspicions that the first ballerina of New York City was a man, but isn't entirely sure. Ballet was actually a huge scandal in New York City, right here on the Bowery, actually, where she danced. The newspapers blamed ballet for the appearance in brothels of girls as young as 10 and 12, which seems like sort of a stretch and also sort of horrible. But this was a very short burst of period where ballet was very popular here. The Bowery Theater here down the street burned down, and a vogue for masquerade balls took over the city, which sounds kind of great. I think they should come back. And there were no portraits of this dancer. There were no journals or diaries left behind. She danced twice more in 1830 and 1831, and then given away. It's kind of fascinating to read this piece in light of the recent Grantland story about Dr. V, if you knew that story, who was the inventor of a golf club, who was revealed at the end of the piece in sort of a shocking reveal to have been transgender, which did not go over well with most people who read it, the way it was treated. But in this case, it's interesting that Lazar leads with it and revisits at the end, talking about that he identifies a man who was born in France and came to America for the same exact period and disappeared and then returned to France. So these stories are notable in a number of ways. They're both very well done. They're both grouped closely together in publication and thematically, and they're also notable in that he never wrote for the New Yorker again. And as Alice Neel pointed out, that everyone was talking about these stories. These were sort of they were aggregated in local newspapers of the time. They were reblogged, I guess, if I may, and and that was it. So I reached out to the archivists at the New Yorker, who basically had nothing. Which is reasonable since we're talking about the 1940s. And also, most of the New Yorker editing staff was off at war, actually, at the time. So Mr. Sean was actually sort of holding down the fort himself while everyone was in the trenches, which just really seems really hard to think about now. So I turned to the archives. The New Yorker archives are held in the New York Public Library, but not all of them, actually. There's a huge question of the missing archives. In 1991, the New Yorker was giving its archives to the library, and a whole pile were disappeared, thrown away. you can note the byline, media enthusiasts, in this 1991 story. So, there were 72 boxes of archives bid it, and have never been recovered, and conspiracy theories run amok about it. The best part of the bottom here is the quote from Bob Gottlieb, who says, "Compared to 100,000 dead Iraqis, what are you going to do?" Which is a totally fair point, it seems to be. Like, okay. It was Operation Desert Storm at the time. So I found very little in the archives. This was sort of another dead end in trying to find Christopher Lazar. There were the copies of his edits were in there of these two stories, which were actually fairly well edited. Not radically edited, not like you think of a New Yorker edit, like they tore my story apart and. But they rewrote it, and they actually made it better if you look at the comparison. But one thing that was on it, sorry, I'm watching my time, was that the ballet manuscript was typed by Lazar and had an address up top, which was something called the Hotel Sevilla, which was on West 58th Street there, just off 6th Avenue, which is now the Central Park Mews. There's very little to be found about that either when you start researching the building or its residents. By the 1950s, as per its certificate of occupancy, it was also a hotel/apartment combo. If you dig far enough, there's something very curious, though. It was also an address for a woman named Elizabeth Wade White for a period in the 30s. She was an heiress and a writer who would later be the lover of a woman named Mary Kathleen McCrory Valentine Ackland. Who was pretty fabulous, also, as you can tell, and a huge lesbian, obviously. I think we can say she actually. So if you do social history or cultural history, you know that whenever two homosexuals congregate in a building, something is up. So this hotel was some sort of something, which is also turning out to be another dead end. But Valentine here moved out her longtime partner, Sylvia Townsend Warner, who was sort of a famous writer at the time, and moved in Elizabeth White and moved her out again. Valentine was apparently like a terrible alcoholic and kind of a mess, and but a good time. So there was some sort of like fabulous lesbian drama going on here. Lazar was apparently living there for how long? Till when? I got nothing. So another reasonable question at this point is, how did he come to be writing for The New Yorker? You don't generally just toss up and jump in. The New Yorker. So we knew Neel must have known Lazar through the WPA. In 1937, Lazar wrote a book under the WPA's auspices called The Crows and the Doves. And it's two stories, and another story is One Little Fox. It's an incredible book cover. Like most writers I know would kill for a book cover like that. The book was actually written for second graders. It's about crows and doves, as per the title. Stunningly, it's also obviously an allegory about race. The black birds here are angry because the white birds are soft and stupid and lazy and don't work, and everyone and it's not fair, which is sort of amazing. And then this was sent by the government into the schools, which is actually awesome and should be done again. So the kids were taught story time about how racism prevents cooperation, and it's actually interesting because this book isn't really in keeping with much of his later work. I mean, it's not like his other later work becomes incredibly racist. It's that it's not as most of his work isn't as political. His digital trail picks up again in like 1939. He published a translation of a Loyola biography, and he began reviewing art in the Nation. In the late 1939, he was writing in the North American Review, trashing the current rage for American art, which was sort of on the rise thanks in part to the Whitney Museum, which is previous to its big brutalist home, of course. And apparently at the time everyone was dividing artwork into American and non-American, which was sort of acceptable and non-acceptable. I point this part out too, especially because it's basically blogging as well. Like he's going on about the museum, he's quoting the Times. kind of trashing the Times reviewer. It seems intimately familiar. So then in 1941, a magazine called Decision was founded. The first offices were at East 29th Street. It's not clear how Lazar fell into working there, but if you look at, there's a few trails that said he was sleeping with its founder, Klaus Maan, who's there with a cigarette. And there's another account that says Klaus had one of his many suicide attempts in 1941, which Lazar prevented. That's Klaus Maan with his sister Erica, who were extremely close. They were two of the homosexual children of the mostly homosexual Thomas Mann. Actually, three. There were three others. Erica was mostly bisexual, and then there were two gay brothers. Decision was basically the N+1 of its time. It had about 2,000 subscribers, a little fewer than N+1, but just like N+1, it printed 5,000 copies an issue. It was also incredibly chic, as you can tell. Klaus leaned on his father pretty hard for connections and money, sensibly. But you can see they were publishing Christopher Isherwood, Heinrich Mann, Jean Cocteau, Janet Flanner. I mean, they published pretty amazing people, and definitely not always their best work, as will happen with small journals, right? But Decision was really short-lived. The masthead changed very frequently. Muriel Roykaiser was an associate editor. Carson McCullers was an editor. Carson McCullers was probably 22 or 23. She'd been in New York for about 5 years and had come to New York when she was 17. The subtitle of the magazine was A Review of Free Culture, which is actually pretty great, too. And it was kind of a combination of ponderous and funny. Lazar wrote art reviews as well as edited. One of his better quotes from there is, "The rather uniform low quality of British art has never been kept secret from the public, nor is it heresy to refer to that fact now." He sort of at Decision, he sort of found his voice. He sort of became more and more acidic, certainly, and also it was clearly a place of just like free reign, like this magazine. It was pretty madness. So Erica and Klaus were sort of raging and rampaging across the country at this time. They were basically the hashtag activists of their time. They did college speaking tours constantly. That's them again. The Mann family was pretty wild. At one point in the 20s, Erica and Klaus were in this play together, and Klaus fell in love. It was about two couples, heterosexual couples, but Klaus fell in love with the other male actor, and Erica fell in love with the female actor, and they decided that the only way to deal with this is that they should each marry the other's lover. And unfortunately, Erica actually went through with it and married the dude that Klaus was in love with, and then they got divorced immediately. It was a mess. A little down the road from that, the family chauffeur was a Nazi spy, but a very bad one because he told them that the Nazis were coming for them. And so the family all sort of fled Germany to different places. I think Klaus went to Paris first. Most of them went to Switzerland. The Manns eventually became Czech citizens. Erica, to her credit, sneaked back into Germany and got Thomas Mann's unfinished manuscript of his latest book, which is pretty good. So they, in 1935, they were stateless, and Erica married Auden, actually. And Auden would later say, like, "Who's the most boring German writer? My father-in-law." So he said in a letter that Auden had never seen Erica before the ceremony, and perhaps I shall never see her again. But he did, actually. They became really good friends, actually, and actually later lived together. So they were Weimar kids, like very much like our millennials in many ways. It's basically how I think of that. Klaus spent most of his time doing heroin. They did a lecture that they took on tour called "What Does the Youth of Europe Believe in Today?" which is actually still a pretty good title. You could totally pull that out. But because the magazine was new and everyone was busy having all this personal drama, like it actually ends up pretty juicy. In issue 3 of Decision, ends his column with a real trashing of William Randolph Hearst's stuff, which was then all up for auction. He'd gone totally broke in the Depression. And William Randolph Hearst auctioned all his stuff off at Gimbel's department store, which is like Rupert Murdoch like auctioning off his stuff at Macy's, which would be really great. He auctioned off this as one of the things, which has changed hands repeatedly and is only accrued in value, as happens. So Lazar wrote of William Randolph Hearst's stuff, "We won't venture an opinion on the furniture, but the paintings seem almost carefully selected from the worst periods in schools. The impression one takes away is neither very sympathetic nor very alarming. One simply has the feeling that warehouses which once were full are now empty. And that somewhere an old man who has outlived his usefulness but isn't quite dead is wondering why everyone is sending flowers." Which is honestly one of the most brutal things I've ever read. Now, unfortunately, like I'm sure that a dozen people read this at the time. Like actually more people have now heard this than probably heard it at the time. And Lazar spent a lot of time going to parties. So he starts. So when you do these, when you're doing this sort of history, you see people enter into well-documented webs and then exit them. And here's a period in 1941 where he starts entering this documented web in diaries and letters. This is the diary of Marius Dr Henske, who I'd never heard of, who would win the Pulitzer Prize just a couple years before this. Was a very famous poet. So she says a couple things that are really notable. Christopher Lazar always makes me a bit uneasy with all his violence and malice and gossip. Some bitter and not unamusing comments delivered in that fearfully unconvincing accent. No idea what accent that might be. And there's a notable thing here, too. There a quote from Lazar, "There he is bewailing his poverty and Nazi persecution, robbed of his possessions, bitter with privation, he staggers with grief daily into his suite at the Ritz-Carlton." So he was making Holocaust jokes in 1941, which is pretty bold. That year, Lazar decides to take a road trip across America. He went down to Kansas, into Colorado, into Denver. He said the good people of Denver were as remote from art as they were from the war. Yeah, I mean, he's actually sort of one to talk. Ooh, this is the problem with pages. They stick together. He stopped in Santa Fe. He said the Santa Fe Museum was full of what might rudely be called the wares of souvenir hawkers. And ended up in Los Angeles, where he met the Thomas Mann's family, who were living in L.A. And later Zadorenska again he went with T.C. Wilson, who reported back. Sorry. Oh yeah, so Thomas Mann is actually very worried about Klaus Maan at this point, who is busy, doing heroin and sleeping with dudes and generally tearing up New York. And Lazar's like, "Why don't you get him a job in Hollywood?" And Mann says, "It means having the Warners to dinner again," which is pretty good. And then he says, and then Golo is there too. Golo's the other gay son, who he said what he needs is a little debauchery. Because Golo was apparently a little depressed. Golo, of course, had just spent time in a concentration camp. So, of course, he's feeling a little down. He was part of the group that escaped over. He actually had to walk over the Pyrenees to get out of a concentration camp. So, life's a little weird after that. If you want the full turnaround, so now we fall into sort of a rabbit hole. If you want the full wraparound, here's a letter to this guy, T.C. Wilson, from William Carlos Williams, saying, "Can you please give money to Joel Gould," who is the guy from the Alice Neel portrait of the penises. So once you start going into these archives, you're sort of like, your mind begins to spin. There's rabbit holes inside rabbit holes. But again, like I said, this is a pileup of people who've written letters and diaries that were saved. And then not just were their letters and diaries saved, but they drew the attention of biographers who... what happens when people write biographies is that some of these names survive, like Klaus Maan survives, and Carson McCullers survives. But when they go through the diaries and the letters, it's people like Lazar who are excised. He's not famous. No one really knew what he was famous for. He never wrote a great novel. And all through this period, Auden, Carson McCullers, Benjamin Britten are all living in the same house in Brooklyn Heights, which becomes a very famous house. McCullers shared the third floor with Gypsy Rose Lee. until she left and was replaced by Paul Bowles, until McCullers left, who was replaced by Jane Bowles, and then Richard Wright moved in, and sort of living in this filth that only Gypsy Rose Lee cleaned up. And the house was torn down in 1945 and is now the BQE. And a Decision folded too, of course. It only lasted a couple of years. And then Klaus Maan wanders off and never really stops wandering. He kept trying to join the military despite being turned down for syphilis and track marks. The military doesn't go for that. And then actually they do finally take him, and he ends up in LA in Europe and kills himself in 1949 at the age of 42, actually. But first, sort of, Lazar has his moment. After Decision, he starts reviewing books for the New York Times regularly. In 1944, he's included in an anthology called Cross Section New American Writing, has Richard Wright in it as well. Lazar gets this favorable review paragraph in the Times, but then the Times sort of veers off. There are several honest stories about what we condescendingly call the Negro problem. And then she starts advancing this rather famous argument. These succeed rather as documents than as literature, which is, the old political art can't be art crap. You see a lot of. So, and this is 1944. This is the year Lazar has his two New Yorker pieces and his books and book reviews in the Times throughout the year. He's sort of at the height of his local fame in New York City. He meets, this is from Ned Rorum's diary. Ned Rorum is recounting this 10 years later. I recall first introducing myself to Christopher Lazar by emptying a shaker of martinis over his head. He was enchanted, which I'm sure he was. In 1946, he published a translation of another book. In 1947, he's harassing Ned Rorum here by phone, bothering him with his own troubles. And this trail is incredibly hot and well documented. And at the same time that the Brooklyn Heights house is raised for the BQE, sort of everything disappears. Lazar disappears from the record. Klaus Maan dies. Carson McCullers leaves the city. Sort of the scene, which seemed like actually a scene, disperses. And then Lazar doesn't crop up in sort of the accessible records until 1950. Which he shows up in a PR report from the Allied High Commission and is described as a well-known editor and writer lecturing at an American house in Germany. That was the U.S. Information Center, sort of the setup in Europe where we talked about how great America is after the war. And then sooner or later, everyone begins dying, which is what happens, pretty much. And so I could find a list of exactly 2 people who are still alive who knew Christopher Lazar. Ned Rorum was one, though that didn't go well. I spoke to his assistant here, and he really didn't remember him. And, this was someone he went to parties with 50 years ago. So I don't really remember the people I went to parties with 2 weeks ago. So it's completely understandable that Ned Rorum at 90 remembers Lazar so little. And then there was another person who knew him. Norman Stone is an academic. He teaches in Turkey. He was Margaret Thatcher's speech writer and foreign policy advisor. So he is the least likely person imaginable to have known Christopher Lazar. And so I'd found one last tiny reference to Lazar deep inside, kind of the searchable internet. And it was in a memoir of Stone's, of his youth. Stone was probably 20 at the time. He was in Vienna. And he fell in with Lazar, who would have been, when you're 20, he would have been much older. And Lazar hated Vienna, is what Stone remembers. And Lazar was very catty. They gave the newspapers out at 6:30 p.m. and Lazar would say, "Do you have the newspapers of the day after tomorrow?" Which is pretty good. I sent Stone an email, it bounced, and I sent another email, and it did not bounce, and he finally wrote back. Which was pretty amazing. I often think of him, and I'm pretty confident of my memory, even 50 plus years on. I think his original name may have been Samuel Pelzing. Please note, the first email I quoted here was from March of last year. I'm now 13 months into this project, and I suddenly find out that Christopher Lazar's name is not Christopher Lazar. but is instead Samuel Pelsling, actually, which we clarified later. You have a vague memory his family were Leipzig bankers. And again, he brings up the brownstone with Auden, the Brooklyn Heights house, and a lot of this. This is a pretty madcap email. Norman Stone is pretty amazing. Let's have a word on the telephone. He was doing a pot boiler for Knopf about the Habsburgs, which is like, sentences don't get much better than that. He hated the Viennese and had a huge influence on me, because for ages that was my only real subject of conversation. And then he regrets not buying like Egon Schiele back then, because he would be very rich, which would be really amazing. So I called Stone the next day, and Stone said on the phone, one thing I remember, he told me he'd been married to a woman who was 7 times a grandee of Spain, and he had a daughter that he was forbidden to see. I have no idea. I think he was and so he suggests that he was in the American army in Germany after the war, probably with Klaus Maan. It seems kind of improbable that Lazar, Pelsling, and Klaus Maan would both have ended up in the military, but it makes sense. This is Norman, by the way. The English people will laugh. I asked Stone about his accent too, remembering what the diarist had said about his fake accent. And Stone had always assumed that Lazar was English, and said his accent was quite convincing and upper crusty. I asked Stone if Lazar had ever hit on him also, and he laughed and said that yes, at 4 a.m, Lazar used to chase him about the library. So unfortunately, here is now we're 14 months in where the research actually begins. So you sort of need the correct search terms. Is honestly, all this stuff I can find on the internet and in libraries is sort of useless without information. And suddenly, once you get something useful, you get a census record. This is a 1925 census record of him being born, him in New York City, birth year about 1912. It actually lists his birthplace as Germany. And that's the New York City census from 1925, which pretty much matches up. There's a couple Pelslings. They're clearly related. They're clearly from Germany. It exists. And then in 1928, this is the Campus, the newspaper of the College of City of New York, which names Samuel Pelsling as a debate club member. Nerd. And with these terms, then I find, so in a box in UCLA in the archives of Edward Roditi, who was a poet, American actually, despite the name, though he spent most of his time in Europe, and of course a homosexual. And deep in the finding guide, there's this, which is a notice from a memorial service for Professor Christopher Lazar, annotated extensively with biographical notes. That is 14 months to the Holy Grail, basically, in and out. They also have you can see here, you can actually, this is the sole search result, that there's an unfinished, unpublished novel also sitting in UCLA there. It's sort of hidden in plain sight, which is interesting about the internet. So now we have what we presume is his death year, which is apparently 1988, which means he lived long enough to see DJ Jazzy Jeff for the likes. And yet we have nothing from 1964 to 1988. We have no idea what happens. 1964 is when he last crops up in Ned Rorham's diary. John Wingate was apparently, whoever John Wingate was apparently obsessed by Lazar. They're probably exes. And he thinks he may have expired in Vienna. Which is incorrect, apparently. So he probably lived to age 75. Probably was born 1912 or 1913. Probably died 1988. And everything else about him will exist far off the internet, in boxes that are tended by librarians and archivists, but are probably rarely opened. Most of the archives I can find him in. There's one at Yale. Was a gay poet I'd never heard of before, who probably receives very little research requests. So this sort of web of stuff that's accessible is sort of scattered and sort of untouched. And it's so interesting to remember that Alice Neel was talking about, how everyone in New York City was talking about these New Yorker articles, and then and then no one ever talked about them again. So I'd like to end this by going to LA immediately and going to UCLA, but unfortunately that's not going to happen right now. Though my next step is, of course, taking it to the libraries.